Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to follow James and his father as they travel together to visit Hoan, a journey that seems peaceful on the surface but hides an emotional trap beneath. When a family reunion turns into a test of control, love, and choice, can anyone walk away unchanged? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The car rolled forward slowly along the familiar road, yet the atmosphere inside was so heavy that James felt as though every meter of distance was being stretched longer than usual. Mr. Hoan sat in the back seat, his posture straight, his eyes fixed ahead, not once turning toward his son. After a long while, he finally spoke, his voice strangely calm. "Come with me. We'll stop by to see Hoan." The words made James freeze for a brief second. He turned his head to look at his father, trying to find in that face some familiar sign of imposition or command, but all he saw was a kind of composure that was hard to read. "Visit him?" James asked quietly. Mr. Hoan nodded slightly. "It's been a long time since I last saw him." Just one short sentence, yet inside James a faint sense of relief rose, difficult to put into words. He turned to look out the window, watching the rows of trees slide backward, and told himself that perhaps his father truly had changed. Even though deep in his memory the old fragments were still there, James chose to trust this rare moment of peace. Then his father's voice sounded again, steady and restrained, not harsh. Yet it was precisely that gentleness that sent a brief chill through James. It was familiar in a frightening way. He remembered the days when his father had spoken to him in the same tone, just before everything between him and Tu Diep collapsed. Back then, there had been no shouting either, only soft words about how everything was for your future. The thought crossed his mind, then James pushed it away. He did not want to doubt anymore. The car stopped in front of a small house tucked beside a dirt road. Mr. Hoan stepped out first and stood still for a few seconds, surveying the surroundings. His gaze swept across the low roof, the faded walls, the narrow yard still bearing traces of mud. He said nothing, did not criticize, but that silence carried with it a cold sense of distance. James stood beside him, followed his father's gaze, and suddenly understood that in his mind, this place had never been worthy of being called a home. The wooden door opened. Hoan appeared, freezing for a brief moment before his face lit up with a bright smile. "Dad? Brother James?" His voice was filled with both surprise and joy. He stepped forward quickly, as if afraid they might disappear if he delayed even a second. "Come in. Why are you standing out here?" Hoan said, already pulling out chairs and pouring water in a hurry. Behind him, Tu stood quietly, her hands clasped together, her eyes never leaving Mr. Hoan. She did not step forward to greet them right away, only silently observing every movement, every expression, as if trying to read what lay beneath the older man's silence. The air in the small house gradually thickened, signaling that many unspoken things were waiting to surface. Hoan had just placed the glasses of water on the table when the door to the inner room opened softly. Tu stepped out, unhurried, not avoiding anyone, as if she had always known this moment would come sooner or later. The instant Mr. Hoan saw her, his eyes darkened noticeably. It was not the look one gives a stranger, but the cold recognition of someone who already knew this was a presence he would not accept. He did not ask her name. He did not need an introduction. "She's still here?" he said. His voice was low and even, yet full of contempt. Hoan stiffened slightly. "Dad, Tu is the person who lives with me." The words had barely fallen when the slap came down. The sound was sudden, dry. tearing through the already taut atmosphere like a blade. Hoan had no time to react, nor did he try to dodge. He simply stood there, his head tilted slightly to one side. Tu Ka went pale, her hand clutching the hem of her shirt, her breath caught in her throat but not escaping as a sound. James sprang to his feet by instinct, his heart pounding violently as old memories flooded back, vivid and painfully alive. Mr. Hoan breathed heavily, his eyes locked on Hoan as though that slap had not yet released all his anger. "How many times have I told you?" he growled. "Don't let worthless things like that drag you off your path." Hoan slowly turned his face back, raised his hand to wipe the blood seeping from the corner of his mouth, his gaze strangely calm. "What do you know about my path to say that?" The question made Mr. Hoan falter for a split second. Then his anger erupted even more fiercely. "You dare to talk back?" He slammed his hand on the table. The glasses of water trembled but did not spill. Watching the scene, James felt the familiar sense of helplessness tighten around his chest. He realized he was witnessing the same cycle as in the past, repeating itself without change. Mr. Hoan turned toward Tu Ka this time, looking directly at her. "How long have you been here?" Without waiting for her answer, he continued, his tone thick with judgment. "Just by looking, I can tell why he's become like this." Tu Ka bit her lip and took a small step forward, but Hoan reached behind him and held her back. "This has nothing to do with her," Hoan said, his voice low but firm. "I chose this life myself." Mr. Hoan let out a cold, mocking laugh. "Choice? You call this a choice?" He stepped closer to Hoan, his voice dropping, heavy with authority. "You have to come home, right now. There is no discussion." Hoan met his father's eyes, no longer avoiding them. "I won't go back. This is my home." At that moment, Tu Ka tightly grasped Hoan's hand. She was trembling yet resolute, standing beside him as his equal. James looked at the two of them, then at his father, and understood that from the instant that slap had sounded, every illusion of change had completely shattered, leaving behind the quiet formation of a confrontation with no foreseeable end. James stood in the cramped room, where the air was thick with things that had never been allowed to break free because they had been suppressed for far too long. He looked at his father, his gaze no longer evasive as it had been before. In that moment, James suddenly realized something strange. He was no longer afraid. The fear that had seeped into his flesh and blood from the day Tu Diep was forced to leave, from the day he bowed his head and walked out of that house feeling like a failure, had now run dry. What remained was only exhaustion. Tired of repeating the same conversation with the same person, tired of hoping and then crushing that hope with his own hands. James spoke, his voice steady and low, recounting his own story not to complain, but as a truth that needed to be spoken. He talked about how his father had once used the names of family and honor to decide in his place, to take away his choices, and to leave behind a void that nothing could ever fill. Mr. Hoan's face flushed with anger. Being openly resisted, right in front of Hoan and Tu Ka, made him feel that his authority was being challenged. He shouted at James to be quiet, but the command rang hollow, no longer strong enough to make anyone bow their head. James looked straight at his father, and in that gaze there was no resentment, only a cold clarity. He understood a simple yet painful truth. His father had never changed. The control had merely become more subtle, softer in form, but in essence it was still the same, stripping his children of their right to live their own lives. James turned to Hoan. In his younger brother's eyes, he saw not only pain, but also a firmness that he himself had once lacked. Slowly, James said that this choice had to belong to Hoan, not to their father and not to him either. Whether Hoan stayed or left, It had to be a decision Hoan could live with for the rest of his life. After saying that, James did not wait for any reaction. He stepped outside, each step like severing an invisible thread that had bound him for far too long. Hoan remained standing there, his hand still tightly holding Tio Ka's. Mr. Hoan stood in the middle of the room, for the first time unable to issue an order that could change the outcome. Outside, James took a deep breath. There was no intense pain like he had imagined there would be. Only a quiet release, like setting down a burden he had carried for too long. Inside the house, Hoan and Tio Ka did not dare to feel relieved. They simply stood side by side, silently aware that the price of staying had only just begun, and that the echoes of this confrontation would stretch far into the days ahead. The car rolled through the night, street lights casting broken streaks of light across Mr. Hoan's face through the window. For the first time in many years, he sat alone without feeling secure. There were no arguments, no one resisting him in front of his eyes, but there was also no longer that familiar sense of control. His hand on the steering wheel tightened, then loosened, mirroring the tangled thoughts in his mind. He realized a truth that made his chest grow heavy. His power was no longer absolute. James had left without looking back. Hoan had stayed without bowing his head. The silence in the car was no longer something he created by choice, but something he was forced to face. Mr. Hoan stared straight ahead, yet for the first time, a vague unease arose within him, as if the foundation he had always believed to be solid was quietly beginning to crack, even though he was not yet ready to admit it. On another road, James walked slowly, letting the night wind slip through his clothes. Life would go on, he knew that. But inside, he felt an emptiness that was hard to name. There was no longer anger, no longer searing pain, only a long, drawn-out stillness. The image of Tu Diep suddenly surfaced in his mind, indistinct yet persistent, like a question that had never truly been closed. James wondered whether leaving today was a true act of letting go, or merely another form of escape, escaping from the responsibility of facing more deeply what had been lost. He had no answer. He only knew that each step now felt both lighter and lonelier. In the small house, the first night for Hoan and Tio Ka passed in heavy silence. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. They sat beside each other, yet the invisible distance of worry was still there. Tio Ka leaned her head against Hoan's shoulder and softly asked if he regretted it. Hoan did not answer immediately. He looked up at the ceiling, where the pale yellow light swayed slightly with the breeze, and for the first time a doubt rose within him. He loved Tio Ka, that had not changed. But love was no longer a refuge. It had become a long road, filled with too many things he could not yet foresee. In the days that followed, pressure began to take concrete form. Hoan's work ran into trouble. Whispers spread through neighbors, through the cautious looks of acquaintances. Money became a tangible worry, no longer vague or abstract. Hoan gradually understood that his father did not need to intervene directly. Society, prejudice, and the harsh realities of daily life were doing the work for him, slowly but relentlessly. In his most exhausted moments, Hoan suddenly remembered the look in James's eyes as he had walked away, and wondered whether the path he had chosen was strong enough to be followed to the end, or whether this was only the beginning of an even greater trial waiting ahead. In the days that followed, Mr. Hoan did not appear even once at Hoan's door. He did not call, did not send a single message, not even a threat like he used to. At first, that silence made Hoan feel relieved, but very quickly he realized it was heavier than any outburst of anger. The forms of support that had once quietly existed began to disappear. Work was delayed for no clear reason. Familiar connections suddenly grew distant and cold. No one said anything directly, yet every door closed in the same way. Mr. Hoan did not need to strike, did not need to force anything. He only had to withdraw the backing that had once been there, to cut off the invisible threads that he himself had created before. Power no longer lay in commands, but shifted into indirect control, slow yet precise. Hung understood this when he sat alone at an empty dining table, hearing Tu Ka sigh in the kitchen over bills they had no idea how to pay. Elsewhere, James received news about Hung through hesitant phone calls, through careful words that avoided details, yet were filled with worry. He knew he was being drawn back in, not by his father, but by his responsibility toward his younger brother. James had once thought he could stand outside, continue living his own life, but the more he tried to avoid it, the more he realized that the bond of family had never truly been cut. In the small house, the love between Hung and Tu Ka began to show cracks that were hard to name. Tu Ka grew weary from the prolonged instability, from sleepless nights worrying about tomorrow. Hung, on the other hand, felt wounded by his own sense of powerlessness when love was no longer enough to shield the two of them. Their conversations gradually became fewer. Their embraces were no longer as whole and complete as before. They did not argue fiercely, but the silence between them grew longer each day. In the end, James decided to face what he had been avoiding. He went to see Mr. Hoan one late afternoon, with no third person present, no roundabout excuses. Father and son sat facing each other, without shouting, without harsh words. Mr. Hoan spoke in a calm tone, saying that he was only letting his children bear responsibility for their own choices. James looked straight at his father, for the first time responding not with emotion, but with a way of life. He said that every choice had its price, but no one had the right to secretly raise that price higher in order to force someone else to turn back. The conversation had no clear winner. It was simply two generations facing each other with beliefs that could not be reconciled. When he left, James understood that he could not change his father, but he could change his own position within that cycle. He returned to Hung not to give orders and not to sacrifice himself once again, but to find another path together with his brother, even if it was harder, even if it was slower. James chose to break the cycle by standing with Hung, not confronting his father head-on, but also not accepting being led or controlled. It was the first time he felt that he was truly living as himself, neither running away nor resigning himself to fate. Nothing ended in victory. Hung and Tu Ka still had to face harsh reality. Mr. Hoan still kept his cold distance. James still carried questions in his heart that had no answers. But that family, after everything, had stepped into a new chapter, one in which each person was forced to pay the price for their own choices, and where the road ahead remained open, full of uncertainty, with no one daring to claim what awaited them at the end of that path. James travels with his father, Mr. Hoan, to visit Hung, believing the calm invitation signals reconciliation. At Hung's modest home, joy turns to rupture when Mr. Hoan recognizes Tu Ka and violently asserts control, repeating the cycle that once destroyed James's relationship with Tu Diep. Hung refuses to submit, choosing his life and love despite humiliation and threat. James, no longer afraid, confronts his father publicly, naming the quiet cruelty behind paternal authority and granting Hung the right to decide for himself. He leaves, breaking from obedience without claiming victory. In the aftermath, Mr. Hoan retreats into silent retaliation, withdrawing support rather than issuing commands. Hung and Tu Ka endure mounting social and financial pressure, their love strained yet unbroken. James is drawn back, realizing distance cannot erase responsibility. The family enters a new chapter where no one wins control.